Yeah, this would have been the original courtyard. The first buildings that were here would have been the church behind you, about 60 feet, and the parish house, which would have been here on this site, which is no longer available because this building was rebuilt in 1867. The buildings after that the monks built would have started in 1848 and started extending this way, 1852, 1853, and then they would have come perhaps about this far. And then right after the Civil War, 1869, a further addition was built that extended a rather good distance. I don't remember how long, maybe 100 or 120 feet. All those structures are gone. Most of that was destroyed in the fire, except for this side here, and that was destroyed because of the building sinking because of the water in the ground because of the fire. The monastery building on that side would have been built in 1854 to 1858, but the structure you see now there was added to it on this side, and that would have been added in about 1996. So you'd have to be actually on the other side to see the original building. And the tower would have been right behind that pine tree, and that would have been built about 1872. The bells were put in 1873, and it stood as the image, I suppose you might say, of Saint Vincent for about 90 years. It's the title for the old yearbook for the college, the tower. It was also gave its name to the high school yearbook, which was called the Chimes. And so it repeated itself in a number of different ways through history. There was a clock on all four faces. They were coordinated so that they would say the same time, and they were coordinated with the bell system. There were 3 bells inside, which were rung at different times for different occasions. For instance, the clock bell would have rung by a clapper. It would use 2 of the small bells. And the big bells were used whenever there was some kind of solemn celebration. All 3 bells could be rung at one time, but it took 2 bell ringers because the bells were rung manually by ropes that dangled down to the second floor level of the building. And I served as bell ringer for a whole year. This building would have been reconstructed about 1867 because the oldest building had been there, but they built the monastery on one side and on the other, and then in 1867 they redid this part to make it match the rest of the buildings. But you can see in the foundations inside some of the old structure. These stones here would have been put in 1867 when they rebuilt the building. That would have been on the site of the old parish house that was built in 1835. Yeah. Now, the fire actually came to maybe about the end of this structure that's still standing, but only up in the top floor, up in the attic, and the top floor, which has been removed, so that now you only see 3 floors. It was originally 3.5 floors. And it ends right here and has been re-bricked on the end. The building that extended that actually was the old building that was built back in 1852. It was not destroyed in the fire, but there was so much water that got into the foundations. There was no basement underneath. The foundations only went down several feet into the ground. But because of the water in the foundation bricks, the building began to shift and sink, and the wooden beams started coming apart. And so it was deemed better after a few years to take the whole building down. This wall is the remainder of the old porte cochere, which stood up perhaps 120 feet or so toward the south at the main entrance to Benedict Hall, the main entrance to the prep school, the main entrance to the school buildings. And there were little pillars on top that held up a roof so that one could drive underneath, be kept out of the weather, and enter into the main door. It was moved here when some of the structure was being redone up here near the entrance to the dining room. So rather than just discarding the structure or using the stones for something else, it was decided simply to put it there as a reminder. But it really would have belonged up here, and it would have stood perpendicular to its current site. The wall behind it, of course, wasn't there. The hall continued, and on the left in the background would be a flight of stairs halfway up to an entrance to the choir chapel towards the left. Downstairs at the storage room, although it's very dark in the hallway, that was the base of the clock tower. This was a window, but the doorway out was underneath the bell tower, perhaps 15 feet in the other direction here toward the south, and the sidewalk was up at that level and went along more or less parallel to the sidewalk as it is now. This is the base of the bell tower or the clock tower. Today it serves merely as a room for storage next to the blue room at the monastery dining room. It has no windows, but the walls are extremely thick. As you can see along the wall here, the old structure, both brick and stone, which would have been the foundation for the whole monastery along here, which would have been in front of the old parish church, that is, the church that eventually became the Students' Chapel, which of course was destroyed in the fire of '63. The blue room is underneath what eventually became simply a hallway upstairs between the regular hallway and the church. There was a gap of about 10 or 12 feet between this new part of the monastery building and the old chapel. Now it serves as the blue room. If you go further down here, you can see that the bricks are still darkened from the fire. One can still see the darkened bricks from the fire. The building was 3 stories above this one, so when all the upper stories burnt, all the debris fell down here, and it's simply smoldered and burned for a whole 5 days maybe, or a week. They poured water in here to put it out, but it smoldered for a long time. Smoke was everywhere. This would have looked out immediately to the choir chapel and the side steps that led up to it right here. Yeah, this is a photograph of the monastery dining room before it became a dining room in 1958. This would have been the library for the monastery and for the seminary. And the collections, scripture, patristic writings, and so forth, were reflected in the ceiling paintings, because over the scripture parts would have been paintings of the Old Testament prophets and of the evangelists of the New Testament. So you could find your part of the library by simply looking at the ceiling. In the hallways here and upstairs, and in what would have been the room above the blue room, there were large bookcases with glass doors that held many of the large tomes that were too big to put in here in the library. So if you needed something, you could come out and get some of those books. We're into the monastery dining room. This was the old monastery and seminary library previously, but in 1958 it was renovated so that it would serve as a dining room. So after about 3 years, it served as the dining room before it was involved in the fire. And because of the huge amount of water that was being poured into the fire by the fire departments on all sides, the water simply came down to the bottom floor here and ran maybe a foot deep out the doorway into the sacristy, and we had to have people with squeegees and mops and anything else to push the water out the side door so the water would not run into the basilica. We could not use this dining room, therefore, for several months after the fire because everything had been pretty much damaged, and the water, as I say, was a foot or so deep. But we eventually got back in here, as a matter of fact, on St. Benedict's Day, the 21st of March. So it was a day of great rejoicing also from that perspective.